yakni hilangnya media karena pencurian, di mana hal ini sangatlah disayangkan, mengingat data tersebut adalah hasil kerja keras selama bertahun-tahun. Oleh karena itu, penyimpanan pada repositori institusi menjadi solusi yang paling ideal. Perilaku peneliti dalam melakukan penyimpanan data penelitian sangat bervariasi. Dalam kajian yang dilakukan oleh tim PDII LIPI, bahwa selama ini peneliti melakukan penyimpanan paling banyak pada media laptop atau personal komputer dan berbagai penyimpanan eksternal. Kondisi ini diperparah dengan backup data yang dilakukan semaunya. Dalam melakukan penelitian, seorang peneliti idealnya sudah memiliki satu perencanaan manajemen data. Banyak sekali manfaat yang akan diperoleh peneliti, institusi, maupun negara ketika bisa menerapkan manajemen data penelitian dengan ideal, yakni efisiensi. Ketersediaan data pada repositori nasional akan mengurangi kegiatan penelitian yang serupa. Safety. Berbagai risiko kehilangan data yang disebabkan oleh perangkat penyimpanan dapat diminimalisir dan juga merupakan upaya untuk melindungi hak kekayaan intelektual. Quality. Repositori akan membantu peneliti untuk menjaga kualitas data dan proses kurasi memungkinkan data penelitian terpelihara sehingga dapat digunakan kembali. Reputation. Seorang peneliti akan meningkat reputasinya saat datanya digunakan kembali oleh peneliti lainnya. Compliance. Kewajiban menyimpan data yang ditetapkan penyandang dana penelitian dapat diakomodir melalui repositori institusi. Pentingnya mendepositkan dan membagikan data jika dilakukan oleh peneliti terbagi menjadi 3 keuntungan. Bagi peneliti, dapat meningkatkan reputasi dan visibilitas penelitian individu. Bagi komunitas ilmiah, dapat meningkatkan kolaborasi. Dan bagi masyarakat, mereka akan mendapatkan akses yang lebih mudah ke dunia penelitian. LIPI, Pusat Data dan Dokumentasi Ilmiah atau PDDI, menginisiasi kegiatan pengelolaan data penelitian melalui sistem penyimpanan data penelitian dengan nama Repositori Ilmiah Nasional atau disingkat RIN. Dengan kapasitas yang tak terbatas, RIN mampu menyimpan dan berbagi data penelitian seluruh peneliti. RIN mampu berkontribusi dalam pemetaan perkembangan dunia penelitian. RIN, kunci kemajuan iptek Indonesia.
Hi, good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today's event. My name is Madiarini Sulaiman and you can call me Reni. I am a research data librarian in PDD LIPI and will be your housekeeper today. Welcome to all of you at the Research Data Management webinar series, Diversity in Science, which focuses on data management planning for researchers. As the center of the National Repository and Depository, PDDI, the Center for Scientific Data and Documentation, has an essential role in managing research data and publication in Indonesia. In 2019, PDDI has launched Repository Ilmiah Nasional, or RIN, an Indonesian research data repository to support research data management activities. It is also supported by Indonesian law about the National System for Information and Technology in 2019. It offers legal protection in scientific data management in Indonesia. This mandate is in line with PDDI LIPI programs in research data management through RIN. There will be more follow-up regulation in making a better research ecosystem, start from the Indonesian Law Number 11/2019, then it will be more technical regulation regarding the one research data. And of course, there will be about data management planning or DMP for research funding proposals. For that, we need to act faster in preparing the human resources needed for the demands in handling those diverse scientific works and data for the future. So this topic is very important to note because it will be implemented in Indonesia through BRIN, the Indonesian National Research and Innovation Agency. So in this webinar series, we will be moderated by Ms. Ria Aryani. Let me show you her resume. I will try to share the screen first. So she is a librarian and information science researcher. She is now working at BPPT, the Indonesian Agency for Assessment and Application of Technology. Her educational background is that she received her master's degree in digital curation at the King's College London in 2015 and joined program with Humboldt, Germany. She achieved her bachelor's degree in library and information science from the Pajajaran University. She has been working as a librarian since 2009 and has various awards and research experiences. She has a special interest in the field of data and digital curation, especially in the context of open science and RDM. Well, without further ado, I would like to welcome Ms. Ria to start the session. Please, Ms. Ria, the screen and the time is yours.
Thank you, Reni. Good afternoon, everyone. The Honorable Speaker, Sarah Jones, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our fourth RDM Research Data Management Webinar Series event with the theme Research Data Management Diversity in Science, curated by PDDI LIPI, the Center for Scientific Data and Documentation, Indonesian Institute of Sciences. Today, we present to you a webinar. We will be discussing about data management planning for researchers. We have a renowned speaker with cognate experiences who will share her practical knowledge on this topic. Let me introduce you to her. Sarah, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much. Very happy to be here and meet you all.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm Ria Aryani. I'm librarian from BPPT, Agency for Application and Assessment of Technology, and I will be serving as your moderator today. I have a few housekeeping notes for this event. The first one, today's session is being recorded to be available for viewing post-conference. You can watch this webinar live at Kepustakaan PDDI LIPI on YouTube. Second one, our presenter today will have a total of 40 to 60 minutes for the presentation. We will hold questions until the end of the session, and I will then read the questions out loud for the presenter to answer. Also, if you raise your hand or choose hand emoji, you can ask your questions to the presenter on your own. You can also ask about the technical issues through the chat room. Today, you'll be hearing valuable presentation from our amazing speaker, Sarah Jones from the GNEU, who previously worked at Digital Curation Center in the United Kingdom on this very timely subject. But before we start, we will have a poll. As part of our webinar today, we would appreciate it if you would fill out the provided poll. Please, maybe host or co-host could display the poll so the audience could see. If you can see the polling now, you can start to fill it in. There are a number of questions in the polling. Number one, what is your role in your institution? Could be librarian or researcher or academician or student or others. Do you produce research data or do you manage? Number three, do you manage research data? Number four, have you used Data First Indonesian Research Data Repository? And number five, have you used research data repository other than Data First? I think the majority of audiences have answered the poll. I think we can end the polling now to get the result. So the result for our first polling, the majority of audiences are 71% are researchers, and 13% are librarians, 8% for academicians and others, and 4% are students. And 79 of them are producing research data, also 79 of them managing research data, but only 21% of them using RIN data first. And 25% of them have used RIN data, research data repository other than RIN data first. I think host can stop the poll now. Okay, thank you for your participation in the polling. Now we move along to our main session. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sarah Jones, who will be speaking to us on data management planning for researchers. Good morning, Sarah, and good afternoon from here.
Good morning. Nice to be here with you all. So I'll just load up my slides so you can see them full screen. Here we go. As Ria and Rini have said, I'm Sarah Jones from Zeeland. I used to work in the UK and I now work in the Netherlands. I'll give you a presentation on data management planning for researchers, and I'm very happy to take questions as they come along. If I speak too fast or if I go over anything and it's unclear, by all means flag that. I'm conscious I'm a native English speaker. I don't speak Indonesian at all, I'm afraid. So if anything's unclear, just note it in the chat and I can slow down or go over and clarify it again. So what I'd like to do today to start is just to think about what a data management plan is. And actually, as a kind of precursor to that, I wanted to just first flag what research data is. I noticed in the poll, most of you are researchers and you're producing data. So you're probably aware of this already. But I just wanted to give this definition that it's really all manner of things that you produce in the course of your research. So my background is arts and humanities. So a lot of the work that people I was collaborating with were doing was dance or performance. And there, the kind of data we would produce was often records of that performance. So the live act itself was our main kind of work, but we might have photographs or drawings, or we may have databases around events that have been run. You can also have, if you're working more in scientific fields, you might have various models, computational models, or data that's come off different instruments. So depending on your field, what data means to you can be quite different. And I also wanted to flag what research data management is. So you've already seen in this video earlier this idea of a life cycle. And data management is really the active management of your data over that life cycle. So obviously you'll be writing proposals and thinking about what data you're going to create. And then you'll be creating that data and performing your analysis and how you store and manage and share your data throughout that process. And also how you share it in the long term, whether you're using a repository or sharing in other ways. That's what research data management is about. And the reason data management planning comes in is because it's useful to plan those actions at the outset to make sure that you have the necessary support and services in place. So data management is really just part of good research practice, and it's probably something that you're all engaging with already, even if it's a new kind of concept or term to you. So in terms of data management planning specifically, which is what I'll focus on today, a DMP is really just a very brief plan that explains what data you're going to create and how that data is going to be managed. So where it will be stored and backed up, who's going to have access to it, and also your longer term plans for data sharing and preservation. And the reason data management plans often come up is because many research funders now ask for these, certainly in the West, in the UK, in Europe, and also in the United States. It's a common condition on grant applications. But even if you aren't required to do a DMP by your funder, it's a useful process for yourself because it helps you make sure that you're not going to lose your data or not have access to the right collaborators. So these are the 5 common themes or questions that typically come up in data management plans. And at the DCC, we have a resources checklist. It's a nice little flyer. I'm sure we could make some available to you if you want a hard copy rather than online version. But typically you describe the data that you're going to create. So you think about the type of data, what file format that will be in, what volume of data, because obviously if you're creating very large volumes, that has bigger storage requirements and you might need to liaise with IT. You also discuss the standards and methodologies you're going to follow for your data collection and management, because if you want your data to be reusable by others, it's important to use metadata standards and to document your data appropriately. There are typically questions around ethics and intellectual property, and this is because this can have impacts on how you share your data, whether you need embargo periods, whether there are any confidentiality issues if you're working with human subjects and there's personal data involved. And then the final questions are usually around the sharing. So who you're going to share with, how, when, and also your strategy for long-term preservation. And these later aspects around sharing and preservation are really when repository services come in very useful, because you don't want to have to facilitate all that access yourself. So if you deposit in a service like the Dataverse that's available in Indonesia, then it makes it easy for others to access your data without you having to facilitate that. So now I've described what a data management plan is, I want to think a little bit about why it's useful to create one, and then I'll go on to explain how to do it and give you some good practice. So as I mentioned before, many research funders globally ask for data management plans. So in Europe, in the US, in the United States, now also in South Africa, there's not actually an Indonesian requirement for a data management plan yet. The regulation in law that was mentioned before, this regulation 11, encourages you to deposit your data, so to think about sharing it. But the publishing and sharing is optional, and a DMP is also optional, but it's good practice and I think it can be beneficial to you. So when, potentially in the future, if a requirement comes in, what research funders are usually asking for is a basic plan at grant application stage. Some of them ask you to update this because you don't always know what's going to happen at the grant application stage. So sometimes they ask you for updates as the project goes on and at the end of the project. But a DMP is usually very short, just like one side of A4, maybe a couple of sides. So it's just a very basic statement, just written text. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really just outlining your plans and justifying any decisions. So if you decide your data can't be shared, often funders will want to know why. Is it because there are confidentiality restrictions, or because the work you do, is going to be patented and, you can't because of IP issues? Another thing that might be worth knowing about is some of the trends that are coming in our space in Europe, because these potentially will happen in your context as well. But we're now seeing that funders are asking for data management plans to cover more than just the research data. So Wellcome Trust, which is a health funder over here, issued new guidelines in 2017 that asked for an outputs management plan. And this is because they wanted researchers to think about all of their content collectively. So it's not just the data, but it's the original software that you've created in the course of your research, because often, the data is meaningless without the software. You need to have that software to be able to rerun the analysis. Or given that this is a health space, they also wanted to know about other materials like antibodies or cell lines that had been used. And also details about the IP and the patents. So I think it's probably worth thinking broadly when you think about your data, particularly if you're generating software. That's a very important output as well. So why do we write a data management plan? Well, this Latin phrase, if you know Latin, it's not really just for the research funder, but actually it's for life, it's for ourselves. And I think the benefits to data management planning are much more for you as individual researchers than for compliance with a funder. So really making a plan at the start makes your research easier, because you know what you're going to do, you've thought about where you'll store your data, you've made sure you've got the appropriate storage. You can also plan, what outputs are going to be important to store and share, which versions do you need to keep, because often you have multiple versions when you're doing your analysis and you might not need to keep them all. So you can prevent yourself from drowning in, millions of files and not being able to find the relevant one for your work. And then you can also, by managing your data well, you can avoid accusations of fraud or bad science. And that's something that we've seen coming up a lot more in the media lately. So it's good to be able to evidence that your research is high quality and can be trusted. And then also, if you do go on to share your data, there are new forms of publication like data papers. You can have a paper that essentially is a description of your data set and all of the information people need to help reuse it. And that paper in itself gets citations, just like your data set does. So you start to get a lot more credit for all of the outputs of your research. So the key message I'd give here is don't undervalue your research data. If anything, it's more important than your publications. There's a lot more that can be done with your data than just with, one article. So I think it's worth taking the time to manage it properly and to make sure that if you can share it, you do share it, because then you build more collaborations and you get more recognition and rewards. So what I want to move on to next is thinking about how you actually make a data management plan and some tips and tricks about what's a good way to approach it and some examples of good practice. So the first thing I would say here is you need to kind of think backwards. So when you're considering sharing data, think about what that end user would like. If you come to somebody else's data set, what kind of issues do you maybe face in trying to reuse it? You don't know the context in which that data was created potentially, so you don't know what all of the different variables mean or how things have been measured or why that data set was created. So if you put yourself in the position of a reuser and try and think backwards to what kind of information do you need to collect about your data so that you can capture that documentation as you go along. And think about how you're going to organize your data, because the way you kind of structure your files and name the files makes it a lot easier, not just for reusers, but also for you when you're going through all of the information you've collected and trying to figure out what's the right data to be working on, doing your analysis with. The second trick I would say is including and involving yourself with other stakeholders in this research data management space. So already you've seen that there's, a repository in Indonesia. So there's somewhere you could deposit your data. There's a team of staff there who can advise on data management issues. And most likely within your institution, there's probably people in the library or elsewhere who can help you with data management. Potentially research funders or your publishers might also have people who can advise on these issues. So don't just kind of feel alone with it. And if you're unsure about how to manage data, do reach out to others. And this is something that I think it's not only useful for researchers, but also for the library community. This example comes from Helsinki University Library. Marie-Lisa, who's the librarian, used the data management plan as a really useful talking point with researchers. So they'd often have one-on-one consultations where the librarian could listen to the researcher explain their project and the work they were going to do. And then the librarian could advise on the different services that could be useful. So depending on the nature of the research, it might be that they needed to point them to the legal office at the university to get advice on IP, or to the ethics committee, or to give them assistance with the IT provision for their lab notebooks or for their storage. So I think the data management plan can be a good opportunity to have this two-way dialogue. And then in terms of writing your plan, the best thing you can do is ground it in reality. So base the plan that you make on the available skills and support that you have from your institution or elsewhere. There might be disciplinary data repositories in your field that you can also use. And also base it on good practice from your field. So various research communities have existing standards, and I'll go on to reference some different metadata catalogs where you can find out about the standards in your different disciplines. So you want to look at what's good practice for your field, what support you have within your institution, and build your plan around that. And then the final tip I'd give here is to plan. If you want to share your data, you really need to plan for that from the outset, because a lot of the decisions you make early on in the project will affect your ability to share later on. So for example, if you're reusing third-party data, you might be taking, I don't know, newspapers, for example. You might purchase access to different newspaper data and do some text mining. The license that you sign for using that material may only allow you to use that material for your given research question. It might not allow you to share your subsequent analysis and make that available because it includes somebody else's data and their IP. And the same with consent agreements. If you're working with human subjects, when you write your consent agreement, you shouldn't just ask for permission to do your research. You should say, you know, I would like to share your data in anonymized form. Do you give consent for this data to be shared and preserved? Because if you don't do those things, then you don't actually have permission to make your data available. If you are applying to a funder that asks for a data management plan, think about costs early on, because if you need to pay for storage or you need to pay deposit fees for a repository, those kind of things can't be included retrospectively. And I think generally it's very useful, particularly if you're working in collaborative research with a number of different partners. It's useful to talk about these data management issues early on at the consortium negotiation stage, so you know who's responsible for each activity. You all understand who owns the data, where it will be stored, who will have access to it. So the final two sections of my talk are about key tools and support. So I'm going to point you to things you can use, so guidance materials and tools that can help with data management planning. And then I'll also give you some worked examples and point out the kind of things you may want to say in a data management plan. So first off, around the tools, the Digital Curation Centre, where I used to work, did a lot of work on data management planning. I think the UK was the first country that really had a lot of requirements for DMPs. So we developed guidance materials, like a how-to guide on how to develop your DMP. We also have examples of data management plans online, so you can look for something in a similar field to you. And then we have tools as well. So DMPonline is an online tool that we created to help researchers develop their plans. So this is what DMPonline looks like. It's a web-based tool, so anyone can log into it just with their email, and you just set a password. And within the tool, you'll see here the different sections of a plan, and it also tells you the question, and it has guidance. Now, the guidance comes from different places. In this example here, this is a Horizon 2020 template. It's what the European Commission asks researchers to answer. So we have guidance from the EC, But there's also guidance from the institution you're based at, certainly if your university's added content, and from the Digital Curation Centre. So there's always some general good practice guidance, even if your institution hasn't added specific content to this tool. So the way DMPonline works is that you're asked a couple of questions at the start about whether you're applying to a funder or just writing a data management plan for your own good practice. And by answering those questions, we decide what set of questions to give you and also what guidance to give you. And your guidance can come from the DCC as general good practice guidance, or from your funder or university, or there's discipline-specific guidance in there too. And then the process of writing the plan is kind of developing your plan. You can share it with collaborators if you want to co-author it. And there's also a review functionality in here because some universities allow you to submit your plan for review and to have like a one-on-one consultation or to get feedback from your university. So the tool has a number of features to support those aspects. But this isn't the only data management planning tool. There's quite a few available. There are other ones, certainly in the Australian context, things like Redbox. There are others in the US like DMP tool. So do look at the other tools as well. Most of them are either open source software or they might be like self-hosted online like DMPonline. So you're able to just go and use an existing service. And then the other good practice guidance I wanted to share here comes from the UK Data Archive, which was also flagged in that video earlier. This is a social science data repository, but their guidance is very general and I think suitable for all research fields. And they have a very useful guide. I think it's about 20 pages, and it's called Managing and Sharing Data. And it has sections on developing a data management plan, how to format your data, how to document it, ethics, data sharing, all the kind of key elements that you might be asked to address in a DMP. So I think this is quite a good kind of starter guide, and it has lots of useful resources linked into it. So to come to a close, what I want to do is actually give you some examples from different data management plans and also point you to some useful resources that can help as you start to develop your own DMP. So I mentioned earlier that there were 5 kind of common sections in a data management plan. And what I'll do is I'll walk through each of these 5 sections. So the first section is usually around your data description. So you note the type of data you'll produce, what file formats that data will be in, how much data you'll produce or how you'll create that data. So there's usually like a few kind of questions you're trying to address in this section. And here are some examples. All the examples I give come from different areas. So some are health examples or biological, some are coming more from, the arts and humanities space. So the first one here, they say that the final data set is going to include self-reported demographic and behavioral data. So here they're describing the type of data that's been gathered from their interviews, as well as laboratory data. So you can see they're covering really just a type. They don't mention about file format. So it's quite a basic description. Probably that's not full enough. If somebody was going to be reviewing your DMP, they'd probably want to see a bit more information. So the second example here, they talk a lot more about how the collection's happening. So every 2 days, they're going to subsample the E. affinis populations growing under their treatment conditions. So this is kind of like a lab experiment. They're going to be using the microscope to identify the life stage and sex of the subsampled individuals. And then they talk about how they're going to document this data. So they're going to document it in the lab notebook and then copy it into an Excel spreadsheet. And then they talk about how they're going to store that Excel spreadsheet. So they're saving it as comma separated values. Now CSV is like a more open and platform independent version of Excel. So even if somebody didn't happen to have Microsoft, which most people will have, they can still read the CSV file. So that's quite a good example. They've been quite thorough in describing how they're collecting their data and the data format, and they've chosen an appropriate format. So one thing to flag here, and you can get this, actually comes from the UK Data Archive guide that I mentioned a moment ago. Some formats are better for long-term preservation and sharing than other formats. So ideally, you would opt for a file format that's uncompressed, non-proprietary. It's kind of an open standard representation. So when we look at something like tabular data, CSV is better than storing it as an XLS, as an Excel file, simply because people might not have Microsoft Office software available. And then the same with other things. Certain image formats like JPEG are lossy formats, so it's not as high quality data as a TIFF or a PNG. So sometimes you need to think about, what's the best way to save your image. And even if you have a proprietary format, so a lot of microscopes, for example, will export the data in a kind of proprietary format because it's linked to the instrument. You can often convert that file to something open, so to like a TIFF file, which is then kind of platform independent. So if you're wanting to share and preserve your data, this issue around file formats is something to consider. And then the second section of the data management plan is around the standards and methodologies. So what metadata you'll record, what are the standards for the metadata in your field, how are you going to organize and then structure your data. And I think particularly if you're wanting your data to be reusable, either by externals or by yourself in a few years' time, it's very important to document it because we all very quickly forget what we actually did a few years ago. So you want to record everything at the time. So the first example here, they talk about the metadata will be tagged in XML, and they're using the DTI, Data Documentation Initiative format. This is a common format used in the social sciences. And then they go on to explain that the code book is going to contain information on their study design, the sampling methodology, the field work, the variable level, and they note that it's all the information necessary for a secondary analyst to use that data. So it's a good example that they've been thinking about what would somebody else need if they were to come to this data set. And then the second longer example here, I won't go through all of it. They talk about, again, how they're going to capture their metadata. They're going to describe all the columns, the units, the abbreviations, the missing values. They, again, note the format. So they'll transcribe this into a text document that will be stored alongside the data file. So keeping the metadata and data together. And again, they flag the standard that's used. So here they're using EML, which is one of the accepted formats used in ecology. So I think when it comes to metadata, it's considering the richness of the documentation you collect to make sure it's reusable by others, but also using relevant standards. And there are a couple of kind of searchable directories of different metadata standards. There's one that the Research Data Alliance has put together, which is a very broad disciplinary listing of standards, covers various research domains, and it points you to tools that you can use to capture your metadata in these different standards. And then the Fair Sharing resource, it originally focused on life sciences. So it's got a lot of standards in that field, but they've been expanding it out to environmental and biomedical sciences and other disciplines. So this is becoming more of a general resource that's suitable for all as well. And what's nice about the Fair Sharing resource is that it's not just the metadata standards. they also link to different databases and policies from funders. So it's kind of an interlinked database of resources. The third question is typically around ethics and intellectual property. So it asks if you're seeking consent from participants, which is very important if you're working with human subjects, or whether you're reusing other people's data, because then you need to think about what permissions you have. And really, as I mentioned before, these questions are typically asked in terms of restrictions that are needed on data sharing. And the two examples from data management plans that I've drawn out here are where there are restrictions on sharing. So the first one is a study that's been done on sexually transmitted diseases. And they say that they're going to be collecting identifying information. And even though they're going to strip the final data set of this information, they're going to anonymize the data set, they believe there's still the possibility of essentially identifying the individuals, because there's quite unusual characteristics that you could couple a few pieces of information. And because of that, they're only going to make the data set available under a data sharing agreement. So not everything needs to be available as open data, so freely accessible to anyone. You might have restrictions on who can use the data and for what purposes, and you might use more secure data services to share the data. And then the second example, you can see they've essentially got like a phased release for their data. So they're going to share the data privately in the first year. It will be in the repository, metadata will be public, but there won't be access to the data. And then they're going to release it to the public within 2 years. It's essentially enabling them to have the first use of the data to write up their publications. And the one key thing I'd flag about this area, I think consent, if you're working with human subjects, often comes up as an issue with data sharing, because sometimes people forget to ask for consent to share the data at a later stage. And if you don't ask for that permission, then data centers won't be able to accept your data. Even if you want to share it, if you don't have the permission from the original subjects that you worked with, then you won't be eligible to share it. So it's useful to consider that at the early stages of your research. And then we're nearing the end now. We're on 4 of 5. So the fourth section of the DMP is around the data sharing and reuse. Whether you're going to share your data, when and with whom, how you're going to make it available, and also how you're going to license your data, because the licensing is very important so that others know how to use your data. So the first example here it comes from the arts and humanities, a researcher based at Bristol University, and they're going to make their videos available on the Bristol University website, both as high definition and standard definition versions, and they're going to have them streaming as well as having downloads. And again, they note that they'll also use Vimeo because they know that's a platform that many of their users will access. And the video is going to be available for downloading and editing by third parties. So they're allowing quite wide reuse, and they're using a Creative Commons license to show people what they're allowed to do. And then the second one here is, again, it's a more restricted case. They're going to have a data sharing agreement, and that agreement has a number of conditions. The data is only available for research purposes. Anyone using it has to commit to keeping the data secure and also destroying or returning the data after they've done their analysis. And the resource I wanted to flag here is around licensing. So this, you've possibly come across Creative Commons already, but Creative Commons is a framework for licensing that you can use for data as well. And there's different conditions. So CC BY is that somebody has to attribute you. They have to say, this is by researcher X. The SA stands for share alike. So you ask that others share their content in the same way that you do, so they're also being open. The ND stands for no derivatives. So you make your content available, but people can't reuse, they can't remix your content, so they can't combine it and make a new product. And then the NC stands for non-commercial. So if you're wanting to make your data available, but not for commercial reuse, you can use this derivative form of the license. And what we see in Europe is that funders typically ask for the most open and permissive license as possible. So they usually go for CC BY, which is attribution only, or CC 0, which is committing the data to the public domain. So anybody can use it for any purpose, and they can modify and adapt it and reuse it or do something commercial with it if desired. And then the final section of the plan is around preservation, which is where the repositories come in, and also your plans for depositing the data. And here you can see in the first example, this is from the social sciences, the investigators, the researchers are working with the staff at the UK Data Archive. And I think that's an important step. Where you have a repository, it's good to liaise with the repository staff, because they can help you decide what to archive, what data has long-term value, and also facilitate that deposit process. And then in the second longer example, this comes from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, so more of like a health example. They're considering what file formats are appropriate for a long-term preservation. So they're following the guidelines from the repository, and they're also making the documentation available for reuse. And they state here a length of time, 10 years, that they're going to make it available and preserve it. And there are lists of repositories. So there's a resource called Re3Data, where you can search for repositories to store your data. If you don't have something available, there are kind of catch-all repositories like Zenodo, which take data from all different disciplines and provide a DOI, so your data is citable. But there is, as we saw in the video earlier, the Indonesian data repository, so called RIN. So I would recommend that you look at the repository and consider depositing there, because it's very good that you have a resource where you can make your data available to others. So just two final slides now. The first one, I've given you lots of examples there, but there are many more examples online. So the DMPonline tool that I showed, there's an option to publish your plan, and there are several hundred plans that have been published by researchers. So you can see public plans there, or there's a list of plans on the DCC website, or there's ones that have come from other funders. The National Endowment for the Humanities, for example, made 108 DMPs available. So if you're working in the humanities, that's a very useful resource. Or other groups like LIBA, which is a library community, have published examples. And also Rio Journal is a journal where you can actually publish your data management plan. So if you're wanting to get credit for having developed a plan, this is somewhere you can publish it as well. And again, you can see examples on their website. So there's lots of opportunity to find things that are relevant to your particular field. And then the final thing, the key messages I would give you are that data management is actually just part of good practice. Whether you're going to share your data or not, I think it's still helpful to develop a DMP, because really that process benefits you. It makes your research easier. I would recommend seeking advice when you develop your data management plan. So speak to your library, speak to the RIN repository, or to other people in your field. And as I said before, base your plan on the skills and support you have available. So the help you can get from IT and library, or from the standards that are relevant to your particular research area. And if you need to, place restrictions on sharing or add in costs to a data management plan, particularly if you're submitting a plan to a research funder, all you need to do is justify those costs. So it's not a problem not to share or to have costs, but you just need to justify those. So that's everything I wanted to say. Thank you very much. And hopefully it's been clear enough as we've gone through. I did see the chat and everything popping up. So I'll hand back to Ria to ask any of your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, for a very informative and interesting talk about data management planning. I hope you all enjoyed.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I hope you all enjoyed the amazing presentation from her. Before, she has talked about the definition on research data management, also about data management planning. She talked about the foundations on building DMP that include data description, standards, ethics, data sharing, also data preservation. She has also shared to us different kinds of DMP tools and support that could help us to make a good DMP later on. I think it's an inspiring to see how you deliver the presentation and bring such important issues and awareness to us on DMP. And we can move to question and answer time right now. I will pick some of the questions from the Q&A box first. The first question will be, what do you think about current embargoes period on opening data? Is it purely about sensitivity or other things? What do you think about it, Sarah?
Yeah, sure. So primarily the embargoes, I mean, it can be about sensitivity, but I think often it's because there's a certain period where either researchers need to write things up. So when it's an embargo, the understanding is that there's a set period where something isn't available, but then it will become available, you know, in a year or 2 years. So embargoes are typically to give you that kind of first right of use. I think if something was sensitive, that sensitivity would continue. So an embargo is not really the best way to handle sensitive data because, you know, in 2 years it's possibly still sensitive. When we think about some kind of political works, I know like a lot of things, you know, that have been done by governments, maybe there's a 30-year embargo. So there, you know, the kind of tension of the day has passed. So it can be about sensitivity. But I think in a research context, an embargo is usually quite short. So I would say probably not longer than 2 or 3 years maximum. And it's usually just to give you that right of first use. And I think where it is sensitivity, it's usually more around like the political side, or, you know, I think some of like the Queen's papers in the UK are under embargo and don't become available for like 70 years or something silly.
Yeah, we should wait until the embargo period gone, right, to make the data open and public. Yeah. So we move to the next question. Sarah, how is your experience in building the habit of researchers in making DMP in their proposals? Could you answer this, Sarah?
So I have a bit of experience from the UK, which is where I worked, but also from Europe, because we worked with through the DCC, we worked with a lot of different European countries. And my experience in the UK was that researchers were often quite resistant because the DMP was something that was forced on them by research funders. They were often frustrated that they're writing their grant application and there's another page, there's another administrative thing they have to do. So the experience in the UK was very much trying to make that process as simple as possible, trying to give people kind of block text as ready-made answers that they could just easily insert into the DMP. What I've seen more in Europe, certainly where the funder requirements were only just emerging and it was more of an encouragement, or where they still aren't really like very strict, was that the DMP could be a bit more of a constructive process. So maybe the university encouraged it, but it wasn't mandatory. And it meant that you didn't have to force everybody to do it. So those that wanted to, it was something that, you know, they could take their time over. There wasn't a pressing deadline. And it also meant that the library or whoever was supporting the DMP was able to build a relationship with the research community. So I think sometimes the compliance driver from funders is actually quite a hindrance because it makes it a negative activity. So I think, if certainly given that you don't have a requirement in Indonesia, I think it's quite good to softly bring in the practice and use it as a way to just raise awareness of library services, and also to help researchers develop good practice themselves. So I think it can be actually quite a good experience and a useful thing. But certainly when there's like a pressing deadline and you're forced to do something that you're unfamiliar with, it can be quite a negative experience.
Thank you for the answer. Yeah, I think we should do that in baby step in Indonesia, as we have no requirement here.
Yeah.
And yeah, the next question will be from Rosganda Elizabeth from Ministry of Agriculture. He asks about, in sociology research, what kind of method we can use and can be applied, about how to make sure that each agricultural development government program accepted and implemented by farmer. Can you answer that, Sarah?
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, agriculture isn't my domain, so I don't know like the standards specifically. But I think regardless of which domain you're in, what I would really do is try and work with the wider research community. So I know within the Research Data Alliance, which is one of the, that's where that metadata standards catalog resource came from. So if I'll put RDA in the chat in a moment. But if you look at the RDA website, there are various groups that are looking at research data issues in different fields. And I'm pretty sure that there is a group that's working on agricultural data, because there's a community of practice that's now forming within RDA around agricultural research. And I think the best way to handle the development of standards or the use of standards in a field like that is to work with that particular discipline and field. So I would take the recommendations or the current practice that's coming from the community, and I think the way you try and get it adopted is by showing the benefits. So if I think about how work's happened in astronomy, they have the International Virtual Observatory Alliance, which is a global body effectively for the field. And they come together regularly to develop their standards, to update the standards, to have discussion around how they govern essentially all of the work they need to make their data interoperable. And as a community, they've decided, how data should be licensed, when it should be made available, so that whether an astronomer's in Australia or South Africa or in Europe, they're all working in a similar way. So it's easy to exchange the data. And I think that's really what you want to do in agriculture too. And if people can see a benefit, that they can access data from a different field, literally like from a different field, not just from a different domain, then they can see the benefit of following the standards. I didn't see that question in the chat, so hopefully I answered it correctly, but if I missed something in the question, just by all means repeat.
Yeah, I think it answered the question. And another question is how research librarian can help and support DMP, and to what extent? Can you answer?
I think, I assume the same applies in Indonesia to what we've experienced in Europe. But in Europe, the library has essentially become a bit of a focal point for data management issues. So the library is the first place that researchers would contact for advice. And even though the library might not have all the relevant skills, so they may pass ethical questions off to the ethics board or legal questions off to the IP office, the library is essentially the place where they can be that pinpointer. They can tell you, where to find the relevant information. And I think for the library, it's a good way of raising awareness of the services that are available, because you are most likely to have things like repository services or support, like librarians naturally classify and document things. So you've probably got good advice on how to structure the data sets and how to, document the research. So I think it's very good for the library to be that first point of call. In the UK, librarians have done a number of different things. They've done one-on-one consultations, like that model that I showed from Helsinki. So that's a good way of kind of supporting DMPs. Others have run workshops where they give a very brief introduction, and then they essentially just have a session where everyone can go on to an online tool like DMPonline and fill in their DMP. And what they do is just circulate around the room and help with any questions. And then it means the researcher leaves the workshop with a DMP. So they've essentially done the job, but they've had support in place while they've been doing it. So I think there's lots of ways you can help and support the development of data management plans. And it just depends on, how you like to run your training, or whether, how you want to make the support available. You can obviously offer guidance online or tools like DMPonline, you can customize it. So you can put in all of the guidance from your institution. So it's easy for researchers to find.
Yeah, I agree with you that research librarian have many roles that could help researchers to
Yeah.
make a good DMP. Now, another question is from Cahyo from PDDREP. He said, you mentioned that there is DMP requirement from research funders in Europe and US. In terms of implementation of that policy, is the DMP in that country becoming the determining factor for the successful of the grant, or is there only formality or obligation? Can you answer that? Thank you.
So it's certainly not the determining factor. So I think in every case I've seen, the determining factor of whether a grant is funded is the quality of the research. So the data management plan probably wouldn't stop something being funded, but it might be a condition on funding. So if there's a very strong research proposal and a very poor data management plan, what's likely to happen is that the funder will say, okay, we want to fund you, but you need to revise your plan. You need to work with your library or elsewhere and submit a better plan. And once we see a better plan, then we'll fund you. I've not seen any cases where the data management plan totally throws out an application. But I guess in some cases where, maybe you've got 3 applications that score equally high, if one has a poor DMP, then maybe it could be that makes it lower in the rankings. But overall, I think the data management plan, now it's being reviewed and assessed more. In the UK and the US, the requirements came in probably around about 10 years ago. And for the first few years, it was very much an encouragement, and there wasn't that much checking of compliance. Now, for many funders, they do actually have formal reviews of the data management plans. That's sometimes by, the library community or by data experts. It's sometimes by the people who are also reviewing the proposals. And that review will be considered as part of the overall proposal evaluation. But still, I would say overall, it focuses on the strength of the research. It's not that a bad DMP is going to kind of jeopardize your funding, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. I think it answered the question. And the next question, in the global perspective, do we have any consensus regarding the minimum information that should be available in DMP?
Yeah, so I would say to a fair degree, what the DCC pulled out in that checklist is pretty good consensus. So even though that work's quite old, we looked at all of the different templates from different funders and pulled out the common themes. So what I used in the talk, those kind of 5 sections or areas, are pretty standard across all of the different requirements. People may word things differently. Some funders, like health funders, have more of an emphasis on the data sharing restrictions because there are usually ethical or sensitive data issues. But we've actually seen recently Science Europe, which is a kind of body that covers all of the research funders in Europe. They've released guidelines which pretty much replicate what's in the DCC checklist. So given that that work's happened a second time and has come to the same conclusion, I think you can take that as pretty much consensus of the minimum information in a DMP.
Yeah, I think research funders can require this different minimum information on that, and you
Yeah,
can use DDC as the guideline.
yeah.
And we move to the next question. We need to think about the upstream processes that determine the quality of data. We do not want DMP merely knowing administrative practice. Could you elaborate more on this?
Yeah, sure. So I agree, and when I was reflecting before on the UK requirements, I think sometimes the DMP can seem like an administrative exercise and something that's annoying because there was a concern from researchers that funders aren't even looking at it and they're being forced to fill this thing in. And this is why I think the DMP should really be something that you create for yourself. That's a kind of internal resource to help you think about how you want to manage your data and document it and share it, because it's more useful to you to plan those things and to make sure that your data is good quality, like you've said, and that you've captured all the information accurately, and that it's reusable by yourself. So I think it's actually more helpful in many cases when you're not forced to create a DMP, and it's something that can be like a personal objective rather than something that a funder requires, because there is a big risk of it becoming an administrative exercise if so.
Yeah, right. I think as researchers, we have to see it as the effective way to manage our research data, right? And
Yeah.
I do have another question. In Indonesia,
Okay.
we have law number 11 2019 that
Mm-hmm.
regulate about the system of RDM. In research institution in Indonesia, we usually provide the infrastructure to manage the research data, but most of the researchers are unaware about how important the MP is. Uh, do you know what could we do about it? The action that we should take?
Yeah, I think again, just that encouragement. So you have infrastructure in place. And I think one of the things that was maybe surprising to you or myself in that opening poll is that not everyone's aware of the repository, or have used it. So I think trying to encourage data management plans, and maybe even if you have a very basic DMP, just with a few questions, and you have guidance that says, how will you share your data? Be aware we have a repository that can be used. It's a way to raise awareness of the infrastructure and a way to start to filter through good practice. So I think one thing that different universities in the UK have found useful is customizing DMPonline, because they were able to essentially flag all of the local support services, and that made it easier for researchers to develop a plan and to answer the questions. So that might be one way to try and start to feed through the good practice and pick up on using the infrastructure that's available.
Yeah, thank you for the suggestion. And let's move to the next question. Is the DMP embedded into ethical clearance too? Can you answer that?
So yeah, now in some cases, yes, but not in many. And one of the issues is that a lot of the questions that researchers are asked in ethical reviews are similar to what they're asked in a DMP. So some of the universities in the UK, certainly, and also in Europe, that are a bit more advanced in terms of their support and procedures, have been merging these two processes so that researchers are only asked questions around their data collection once, rather than having to do ethical clearance and a DMP. But at the moment, I would say in most cases, they're two separate processes, and that can lead to frustration, certainly when it's similar questions being asked.
Thank you for the answer. I think we have answered all the questions from the Q&A box, but I saw before someone raised his hand. Andi Ahmad Zailani, maybe host or co-host could unmute to Mr. Andi. Mr. Andi, you are allowed to ask to the presenter directly. Can you unmute the microphone, Mr. Andi?
And just while he's unmuting, I see there was a question in the chat around, can we get the presentation material? I've actually put the slides on SlideShare already, so I'll post a link to the slides in the chat, and I assume the video is also available at the end of the event. So
yeah, I think if we have more questions or have any concern again about DMP, we can contact you as you.
Yeah, very happy for you to email through. So on my slide, you'll see my email on the first slide. I'm also on Twitter, so you can message me online. And the slides as well, I know some people in the audience are librarians. The slides are all openly licensed. So if any of it's useful content that you would like to reuse, like by all means reuse the slides as well. I'll just put the link in the chat there to where they are on SlideShare.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any other questions from the audience for Mr. Andi again? Can you unmute to ask the question? Maybe host or co-host can help him. I think.
Yes, we have give a permission to Mr. Andi, but maybe Andi is not on the screen.
Yeah. Maybe any other audience who want to ask to Sarah?
Yeah, and as Ria said, if questions come up later, sometimes it takes a while for information to filter through. By all means, email out with questions. It's not a problem.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Sarah. I think later someday in the future, if we need to assistant in DMP again, we can contact you directly through email or Twitter.
Yeah.
And yeah,
perfect.
Thank you very much for yes, I think we don't have any question more. Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, for answering all of the questions in discussion session. One last thing, do you have any closing remark about the MPN discussion that have been going on?
No, just very happy to be here with you all. And yeah, good luck in any data management plans you create. I did see a question come up in chat there about if there's an example of molecular data. I'm certain there will be. It's not my field, but there are hundreds of examples online. So I would look at, I think it was about 3 slides from the end in my presentation. There's a list of like different indexes of example data management plans. So if you look either on the DMPonline tool, you can look for ones that are around molecular data, or in Rio Journal or these other directories. And I'm sure there'll be examples that are more suited to all the different research domains you're based in.
Yeah, your slide can be very helpful. I think they can running through your slides if they need it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're so glad to have you here in the event. I hope there is another chance that we can meet again later.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be.
Yeah,
hopefully maybe at like an RDA conference or something, as this travel. It was meant to be in Seoul, but it's been pulled because of the epidemic, and will
yeah,
just be online. But at least that will be in your time zone. So hopefully I'll maybe see you at another online event or in person somewhere one day.
yeah. Thank you again, Sarah. We almost reach at the end of the session, but before we end of the session, we have another poll. We arranged that for reviewing the today's session. Polling number 2, we appreciate it if you could fill out the polling provided. Maybe host can display the second polling, or co-host can display the second polling for us. Yeah, if you see the polling, you can start to fill the poll. We have 4 questions in the poll. Question number 1, do you know more about RDM from today's event? Will you consider providing research data services in your institution if it's available? Will you consider using research data services in your institution? The last question, will you participate in other RDM webinar series in the future? I think we can end the polling now, as the majority of audience have answered it. For number 1, 96% audience have understood about RDM from today's event, and 64% will consider providing research data services in the institution, and 80% of audience will consider using research data services if available, and 92% of audiences will participate in RDM webinar series in the future. Thank you for the participation. The host may end the polling and close it. Yeah, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, finally we come to the end of the presentation. We would like to say thanks again to the presenter for her informative and valuable talk. Thank you, Sarah. I can see that many people have got inspiration from today's event. And
Excellent.
thank you.
Nice to hear.
And thank you to the audience for active participation in the discussion. Hopefully the presentation will be beneficial for everybody. Thank you for your attention. I wish you all a pleasant day. It has been my pleasure to moderate this webinar with you. Good afternoon, stay safe and healthy. Now, back to Reni, our host.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Ria, for helping us moderating this session. It is very much appreciated. And thank you, Sarah, for your knowledge sharing and your available time for us for speaking in this webinar. Thank you to the audience for your wonderful participation, and also huge appreciation to PDD LIPI, Mr. Hendra Subagio, for your support in realizing this webinar. Also gratitude goes to the organizing committee for your relentless effort for this webinar. We have Mr. Cahyo, Mr. Rizal, Ms. Untari, Rulina, Dina, Natalia, and of course, Ms. Ria as our moderator. You can access the recording of the webinar on our YouTube at Kepustakaan PDD LIPI. Then the presented materials can be accessed as Sarah already shared on the chat. And also you can check also on the chat, there is a link, bit.ly link about the presentation material that we have put there. So thank you, and I finally and officially close this 4th webinar series. Good afternoon, stay safe and healthy. See you on our next RDM webinar series. Bye.
Thank you. Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye-bye.
Saat ini, kegiatan penelitian di berbagai bidang memiliki tingkat ketergantungan yang tinggi terhadap data-data penelitian. Kemajuan yang sangat tinggi dalam kegiatan eksperimen yang didukung oleh teknologi komputasi telah mendorong kegiatan menggunakan dan menghasilkan data dalam volume, variasi, dan kecepatan yang sangat tinggi. Dalam era open science, data penelitian yang dihasilkan memungkinkan untuk diakses oleh peneliti lainnya, sehingga mereka dapat meningkatkan integritas dan kredibilitasnya. Kondisi penyimpanan data penelitian di Indonesia saat ini masih dilakukan secara terpisah di masing-masing institusi dan dilakukan oleh peneliti secara individual, sehingga cukup sulit bagi pemangku kepentingan di bidang riset untuk melihat sejauh mana perkembangan kegiatan riset berdasarkan data penelitian yang dimiliki dalam skala nasional. Terlebih lagi, repositori institusi sebagai wadah penyimpanan aset pengetahuan saat ini baru dimanfaatkan sebatas menyimpan karya atau publikasi ilmiah. Di negara maju yang telah berkembang kegiatan risetnya, negara memiliki tanggung jawab dalam melakukan pengelolaan data penelitian melalui repositori nasional, seperti Australia dengan ANS, Inggris dengan UK Data Service, serta Belanda dengan DANS. Pengelolaan data penelitian dengan menyimpan pada media tertentu seperti komputer, laptop, atau eksternal hard disk kurang dapat diandalkan dan beresiko untuk rusak. Selain itu, ada resiko lain yang tak kalah berbahaya, yakni hilangnya media karena pencurian. Di mana hal ini sangatlah disayangkan, mengingat data tersebut adalah hasil kerja keras selama bertahun-tahun. Oleh karena itu, penyimpanan pada repositori institusi menjadi solusi yang paling ideal. Perilaku peneliti dalam melakukan penyimpanan data penelitian sangat bervariasi. Dalam kajian yang dilakukan oleh tim PDII LIPI, bahwa selama ini peneliti melakukan penyimpanan paling banyak pada media laptop atau personal komputer dan berbagai penyimpanan eksternal. Kondisi ini diperparah dengan backup data yang dilakukan semaunya. Dalam melakukan penelitian, seorang peneliti idealnya sudah memiliki satu perencanaan manajemen data. Banyak sekali manfaat yang akan diperoleh peneliti, institusi, maupun negara ketika bisa menerapkan manajemen data penelitian dengan ideal, yakni efisiensi. Ketersediaan data pada repositori nasional akan mengurangi kegiatan penelitian yang serupa. Safety. Berbagai risiko kehilangan data yang disebabkan oleh perangkat penyimpanan dapat diminimalisir dan juga merupakan upaya untuk melindungi hak kekayaan intelektual. Quality. Repositori akan membantu peneliti untuk menjaga kualitas data dan proses kurasi memungkinkan data penelitian terpelihara sehingga dapat digunakan kembali. Reputation. Seorang peneliti akan meningkat reputasinya saat datanya digunakan kembali oleh peneliti lainnya. Compliance. Kewajiban menyimpan data yang ditetapkan penyandang dana penelitian dapat diakomodir melalui repositori institusi. Pentingnya mendepositkan dan membagikan data jika dilakukan oleh peneliti terbagi menjadi 3 keuntungan. Bagi peneliti, dapat meningkatkan reputasi dan visibilitas penelitian individu. Bagi komunitas ilmiah, dapat meningkatkan kolaborasi. Dan bagi masyarakat, mereka akan mendapatkan akses yang lebih mudah ke dunia penelitian. LIPI, melalui Pusat Data dan Dokumentasi Ilmiah atau PDDI, menginisiasi kegiatan pengelolaan data penelitian melalui sistem penyimpanan data penelitian dengan nama Repositori Ilmiah Nasional atau disingkat RIN. Dengan kapasitas yang tak terbatas, RIN mampu menyimpan dan berbagi data penelitian seluruh peneliti. RIN mampu berkontribusi dalam pemetaan perkembangan dunia penelitian. RIN, kunci kemajuan iptek Indonesia.